Hello, welcome to Chapter 3 Podcast, the show for readers of science fiction, fantasy, and romance. This is Season 2, Episode 12. Today, we are discussing The Last Argument of Kings by Joe Abercrombie and the entire First Law trilogy. And we're really excited to have a special guest with us this evening. So, welcome Heather from Book Hooked Heather on Instagram. If you want to introduce yourself and anything you want to share with our listeners.
Was it tell your post-war story, i.e. how Leanna got you to read this?
I mean,
how you got drafted.
I mean, I feel like friendship with you means getting drafted into reading
I think
Abercrombie.
I said that in a video recently. That was like, to be my friend is to be coerced into reading First Law.
It's kind of true.
And we usually agree on we have similar tastes, especially in fantasy, and have like similar expectations. And you were like, if you have these expectations, you're going to love this. And I think I put it off for so long because I was like afraid what would happen if I didn't like it.
Friendship saved.
Yeah. But then I like slowly collected. And then a couple months ago, I was like, I'm going to do it now. I am in a good headspace for long fantasy. And when I first started reading it, like the first book, I was turned off a little bit, and you were like, try the audio and just push through that beginning part. And then once I did, I was like, this is the most genius trilogy I've ever read. And the audiobooks are just amazing.
I was gonna say our friendship did have a little rocky moment there when I was like, oh no. And I was like, okay, but a little longer, just try a little more. You will like it.
Yeah. Stephen Pacey's amazing though. He's such a good narrator. Yeah, the audio.
Well, I mean, it's a little bit like a one-man play.
It is like the voices. I'm so impressed.
And he said before that it's kind of like a dream, like that it's kind of a dream gig for an actor to get to play every character, because he was like, yes, you get to play characters that you might get cast for, but I would never get cast as Artie or Pharaoh, and I get to play them too. So it's like, as an actor, to just get to do them all.
Yeah.
And he just like characterizes them in such a great way that you can't help but root for them, which I think was missing when I was just like reading the text on its own. Because then when I went back to read it after hearing those characters in my head, it made me feel for them. Like he made me feel so much for these characters.
Well, even Joe Abercrombie has said that like he hears the character voices the way that Pacey writes them now.
I love that. That's amazing.
So like the French accent for Pharaoh, like he did not imagine her to be French until he heard Pacey, and then forever after she was French in his mind.
That's incredible. Okay, so as we've done with other episodes, we will do a little bit of a non-spoiler section before we hop into trilogy spoilers. I guess overall thoughts on this. Heather, I think this is your first time reading this, yes?
Yeah.
Okay. So we have like a bit of a variety. So Bethany's first time rereading it.
This was my first reread.
First time reading it, and let's not count how many.
many times. So thoughts. I guess Heather, you're like the one who's like, this is your first time. So how did you get on with this? Non-spoilers, but like
non-spoilery. It was interesting. I was telling Leanna that like I thought it was going to be a lot darker than I thought that like the last book was going to be a lot darker. But in some ways, there are these brilliant moments where it's like just a mundane kind of ending that feels like so real. And, Logan has that repeated line that's like, you have to be realistic about these things. And I feel like this ending is as realistic as the whole series have been. They're like just moments where you're expecting something fantastical or big, and then just like it's a mundane kind of feeling, which is not a criticism at all. I think that that's actually really brilliant. And I just thought it was just amazing seeing how all of these characters kind of came full circle. And there was a circular narrative to like the way that circular storytelling to the way that he did things that I thought was just really amazing. That I think you can only do if you write like he does, where you write out all the 3 books all together, because you really see, like once you finish it, you're like, oh, I saw where that was all going. So it was a fun.
Even with the standalones, like he just has a habit of having characters end up where they started. Like he likes doing that. So like in a trilogy, that will take 3 books. In a standalone, it takes 1 book. But like his characters, like no matter what they do, no matter how they try, they end up pretty much right back where they started.
Right. And there are micro changes, but they're very small. Like there is character growth, but it's not the kind that we're used to seeing in a lot of fantasy. This like big moral
Or even
yeah,
even the ones that perhaps end up in a different like outwardly, you know, like their situation, their position, their title, whatever, like if that changes, but like their role in it and who they are to it, like who they are is still right back where they started.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think this is still, at least at this point, probably my favorite book of the trilogy. But it was interesting rereading because there were things that I had forgotten or maybe like didn't totally put together the first time that I read it. So it was still like there were still some things that I was like, oh, like I had forgotten that thing. So
And
it
just in
was
general, I
interesting.
think that's like what I titled one of the thumbnails like for my review for this book is that this is the one that makes you go, oh, because like the entire book is you being, oh, and he is, and all this time, oh,
Yeah.
I actually prefer the second one. I think the second one is, as a first read through, the second one's actually my favorite.
That's funny because like I agree with Bethany that the third one was my favorite the first time through, but now that I've reread it a whole bunch, the second one is my favorite.
That's so interesting.
I just think it's really fun. Like it's one of those that I really love, those like journey books when characters go on a journey. Whereas like I would say that the third book is the war book. And I've talked a lot about how this is like an anti-Lord of the Rings. And so like the first book, you get like the gathering, and then the second book is the journey, and then the third book is the war. And I really love journeys. Like I love that. And I loved what he does with it, with your expectations, with the characters, and like seeing them all in play. And I think that when they go on that journey, they learn a lot of things about themselves. That's where you see the micro changes. And then in the third book is when it's like, can the changes be sustained back in real life? And that's kind of the question the third book asks. Sometimes the answer is no. Changes
most of the time the answer is no.
Yeah.
It's kind of almost like the, you know, if you go on like a wellness retreat and you're like, I'm going to be healthy like this. And when I come, and absolutely not.
And you see that every single one of the characters in the journey was like, when I get back, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z. We're going to live this life. And then it gets tested and none of it can be sustained. And I was like waiting for that moment in the third book. And I was like, this is too real. It's hurting me.
You know what? It's so interesting because I think that's why the middle book is my least favorite, is because I don't really like journey books. And so
I almost started laughing when Heather was like, I love journey books.
I love it.
And
I'm
so the opposite of Bethany.
Whereas I'm like it's like that's like one of my least favorite things to read in fantasy. And so I'm like, I love Glocta's sections in book 2, but the rest of it I'm like, okay, like yes, this was our whole last episode, was me being like, yeah, a lot of interesting character development happens. I don't like being on journeys. So, but it's great. Like if you like journey books, then like Before They're Hanged is fabulous.
So yeah, the whole last episode was me being like, and this is so good about it and so interesting about it. And he's like, I'm happy for you. I don't feel that way.
Well, and I love though, I think again, like Abercrombie is like, if you are patient with his books, you get those like major rewards, even if they're not like the usual big fantasy stuff. But like, can I do spoilers? No, I can't do spoilers for the
not yet.
End of
we'll get there.
Okay, never mind. I will hold off on that opinion.
We'll have lots of spoiler chats too, but yeah.
I think it's just that like he sets you up for all of these expectations, and then it's just like the way that he either like uses those expectations, plays into them, or doesn't is just really interesting. So he takes you on the journey, but he's doing some really interesting things that you don't see in at least the fantasy that I've read. So every time he did something, I was like, really into, then I would write it down.
So when you said that this is like an anti-Lord of the Rings, like you couldn't be more spot on, because he basically has said that was his intention, is to write like a deconstruction of the traditional like fantasy arc, which like Lord of the Rings is like the granddaddy of all. Like, so like that is the template that he is now shitting on.
Well, I mean, the whole first law is like an anti-gathering of the fellowship. Like, you know, Baez is going, the old wizard is going around collecting all of the people, and everyone's like, I really don't want to go, you know.
But like not just in terms, so like the more like obvious like way that he's, you know, subverted the Lord of the Rings kind of thing is to be, okay, we're gonna make everyone terrible and we're gonna make things unsuccessful and we're gonna whatever. But like he has also like the time that he really talked about when he brought up it being the anti-Lord of the Rings was not actually to do with the characters being awful or the quests being, you know, dark and grim. It was more to do with the storytelling itself because of like how people talk about how this trilogy feels meandering and feels directionless. Like, where is any of this going? Why haven't you told me anything? And how he was interested in telling it in a different like noir style where you start in different places and you don't know what's happening. And he like very specifically brought up that he didn't want to tell it like Lord of the Rings, where Gandalf shows up and is like, well, my boy, this is what we're going to do. And then we do the thing and then we're done.
Yeah.
Well, that's what I was going to say about the second book, because that second book, you really do get that where you think you're working towards something and then, but yeah.
But it's maybe not what you thought it was.
But the way that a traditional story like Lord of the Rings will like clearly lay out for you, like, here is the quest. I am the old wizard and I'm here to tell you that this is the bad thing and this is our goal to defeat it. And then we're going to do the thing versus like the Blade itself. Everyone is like, I think I know who these people are now, but also like, what is any of this and why is any of this? No one has shown up to be like, this is our quest.
I wonder if he's done, maybe you probably know the answer, like, but if he reads a lot of like Arthurian legends, because like the original Arthurian texts are very meandering, where they go on one quest, but it's not really what they thought it was. And so I wonder if he reads any of that and gets any of that. Because I think that like Once and Future King, which is a more recent, there are elements of that book, but I wonder if he's ever gone and read like medieval, like King Arthur stuff. Because
well, I know he's a big fan of like history in general, but he tends to be, well, in terms of what he speaks about, he's very fascinated by the American Civil War, and he's very fascinated by like Machiavellian politics, and he's fascinated by like the city-states of Italy, and that's more what he's talked about.
A lot of that kind of woven in here in different things that happen, which is
and even more so specifically like the fighting city-states is like totally the inspiration for Best of Cold.
Okay. Interesting.
And I think that that's what one thing that he does really well is he creates these like political worlds that are easy to understand. Like sometimes I feel like when people are doing it, it's like inconsistent and it can become like nonsense sometimes. But he does like a really great job. Like I'm reading The Poppy War, which is similar, but because like the narrator of The Poppy War, like the main character, is like just as confused about the world or like doesn't really get the politics. It's like a little confusing, but all of his characters, like I think having Glocka there is really interesting.
I was gonna say, like, if you only had the story told to you by Giselle, you'd probably feel pretty lost.
Right.
So like the way
like what's happening? Yeah.
So
I just love Glocka so much, and I love his character arc. Like it just like his ending makes me happy.
Well, I like noted it. I didn't note exactly his phrasing, but I noted it to bring up that like I'd forgotten he literally says this because I talked about how The Last Argument of Kings was my favorite book the first time because that's when you get the payoff. That's when you find all these things out and you're like, oh my goodness. On reread, you know, that's not that interesting anymore. I know the answers. So like getting the answers, I'm like, yeah, no, I know. But Glocka literally has a line in Last Argument of Kings where he's like, he's getting some answers. And he's like, but answers are boring. It's the questions that are really interesting. And I'm like, exactly.
And then again, I think that is like what I was trying to say about the mundane parts is that when you get the answers, they weren't as fantastical as I thought that they were going to be. But again, that's not a criticism because I think it's brilliant. Because I think
that's where, again, I mean, I think that's what Glocka's line is getting at, the whole like the enticingness of the mystery box, you know, as J.J. Abrams put it. Like that's so exciting because it's infinite possibility of what the answer would be. Is it this? Is it this? And when you get the answer, you're like, yeah, I mean that checks out. That's yep. I guess that's great. Now I know.
Okay, do we have anything else we want to talk about that is not spoilery?
No. I think we're all eager for spoilers.
Okay, we're gonna officially move into spoilers. I just have to say, I am like so team Glocka and Artie. I just love them together so much, and it makes me really happy. And I don't know, it's like the most unexpected thing, but it's so cute. And I love her whole thing of how she's like, no one gets what they deserve. And I was like, it's true. And it's like, I don't know.
I that she's like, I want to feel useful.
Yeah.
That like when she's saying I'm gonna make the best of this, she's not like, I remember how handsome you were, and I see the man underneath, and I thought it's nothing like that. She's just like, look, we get on, and you've always treated me right, and I can be useful, and that makes me feel good. So this can make me happy in its own way.
And he'll have a good life. Like he's gonna be wealthy and powerful.
He's gonna take care of her. Like
he's gonna make sure that no one talks shit about her. And like after all that she's been through, I mean, that's such a relief to not like.
Also, Glocta telling Giselle, "Oh, I'm recently married. I think you know the lady, Ardee
honestly,
Glocta." He's like,
"Oh, it's so good. It's such a satisfying moment. Oh man,
it's just because you hate Giselle so much in the first book, like to have that kind of.
But also, like, even though you've come to kind of like Giselle, Glocta still hates Giselle. So he's like, "Oh, look who I'm married."
Well, and I think like on Ardee's behalf, I'm like, yeah, you were kind of awful to her. And I mean, I know I keep saying this. I wish Ardee had been a POV character because I just find her to be so interesting.
Yeah. It's fine. But I think that was one of, again, those things that was like, you know, Giselle has all of these ideas about who he's going to be. You know, when he gets back from his journey, he's going to love Ardee. And then we see that play out and it can't be sustained. Like their love can't be sustained. And even if he didn't end up as king, like it's not really believable that they would have ended up together.
Well, like, I can believe, you know, because he initially is like, I'm gonna, you know, get out of the army, and like he's like fully committed to this.
He probably
decision.
would have, I feel like.
But I feel like so like the thing that couldn't have been sustained would be happiness. Like he would have like just willfully, just like flippantly been like, I'm gonna marry her, and then he would have done it and instantly regretted it, and they would have hated each other, and it would have been terrible.
That's accurate.
Because it's like and I think it goes to show that when you're on these journeys, you create these things on a pedestal. You create a fantasy. And then this book is like, but the fantasy can't be sustained in reality. Like that's kind of what this book forces you to look at.
Well,
and like
Giselle even has that moment when like he comes back and he's faced with Ardee and she's drunk and she's rude and he's like, this is not the Ardee that I was dreaming about while I was on my quest.
But she was always like that. Like it wasn't really anything different. She was always that. He just like had this idealized idea of her. Well, and I think what's interesting with him too is he, you know, he comes back and he's like, I'm changed. I'm going to like take Logan's advice and like all these things. But like the second that people start like elevating him, even when he knows he doesn't deserve it, he's like, well, I'll take those accolades. Sure. I'm like,
there's a very fast biting him in the ass turnaround for him being like when he instantly gets the promotion. He's like, well, I did the suffering. I may as well take that promotion. And then like 2 seconds later, like, great. Now that means you get to take care of this like uprising. And he's like, I can't get out of it now because I just
like,
said yes to this.
Why didn't I just get out when I could have gotten out? Yeah.
Oh gosh, like reading. I remember I would like message Leanna every time like Giselle's like would come on because I was just laughing so hard at his like process. It's like inner monologue, which is cracking me up.
But if anyone can be said to have changed long term at all, it is Giselle.
Yeah,
like he is different than he was when he left.
He is. It's true.
Well, and you do, and I think that that's what saves his character in the end. That even though he's not like strong enough to come up to like hold his own against all of the bigger players, like you do see that desire to want to make a better world for like his people. Like you see him out there rebuilding and like, and I think that's what like kind of saves him against like his other kinds of cowardice. The fact that he does really, even though he's and I said this too, that like, he's the idealist. Like I'm an idealist. Like I can be an idealist about what I want to happen in reality. And I like identify with that a little bit.
Well, he retains like this insane amount of naivete. Like like in terms of his own position. And it's like, well, I'm king now. And you're like, okay, but like, do you seriously think that you're king? Like you better than anyone know that Baez is Baez. And that he's like mouths off to Baez and is like, I'm the king and I will fix this country. And then as soon as Baez says he's leaving, it's like, great, now I can be in charge of the country. I'm like, sir, do you really think that? Like, you're not the brightest bulb, are you?
No. And like Baez's character, I think was really interesting because in the first book, I thought he was like this Gandalf character where he's like,
he is the anti-Gandalf.
He is. And like by the third book, like the whole third book, I was waiting for this like wizard moment. Like this like moment. And then like you realize that he's just an evil politician. And it is again, like this, the fantastical made mundane. Like he just has a lot of money. and he's been like puppet stringing for centuries. And it was just like one of those moments that was like, oh man, like Baez, I don't know.
Yeah.
He doesn't get his comeuppance. Like he doesn't ever learn anything. He's just like,
nope.
Well, the thesis, if there is one of the first law, is that might makes right and the banks are evil.
Yeah. And like it basically is a criticism of capitalism that like really we live in an oligarchy, right? That it's like money that rules the world.
And it's not just Baez that says it. Glocta also laughs at the idea of like people having a say in their own fate. Like people don't want to decide. People want to be told what to do. Like even Glocta thinks that.
Yeah, well, because like the way it's laughed, like that concept of democracy is kind of laughed at of like, no, like people don't actually want that. Like, they just want you to tell them what they need to do. And it's
those sheeple.
Yeah, it's like all taken care of. Like everything's taken care of. No need to, like, he's the real king. No need to look further into it. Just like believe this fantasy and it's all good. Your life will be.
Yeah. Another scene I thought was really satisfying was when West finds out he's been made Lord Marshal.
Yeah.
Well, even before that, his like the way he handled like Burr being sick and like trying to navigate that, and then when he has to navigate those guys now being his underlings, like, so genius.
It was so smart, like pitting them against each other.
He feels the prince. It's like, what does that say about me?
Well, then it keeps coming up too when he realizes he's been promoted, and part of the reason that he got promoted is the chain reaction of like, the princes both died, therefore we needed a new one, and that new one happened to be my friend, and he promoted me. Right. And it's like, if I hadn't killed the prince, I wouldn't have been promoted.
Well, and the fact that he's like, it's also a friend that like I don't even like very much.
And even Giselle doesn't like him very much, but he's like, a name that I recognize.
Right.
He will be my Lord Marshal.
This is where I'm going to stand. This is it. Yeah.
And then like the way that he dies at the end, again, it's like not some like glorious battle scene. It's like an illness, and that's it.
And even him and Glocta, they have a conversation about how like the young men who die in the battlefield, they might be the lucky ones instead of the ones that come home and like get wounded and grow old and get sick and like fall apart and have to watch themselves fall apart. He's like, they get to die young in glory and never grow old. They're the lucky ones.
Yeah. And then like, and I think that there's this idea of like, it gives death a meaning, even though like in the moment of war, like nobody feels that way, but it's like the story people tell of you. Right. And like West, I think feels that acutely when he's dying of this illness. It, like in his head, it just would have been better instead of like dying slowly and awfully. God, it was so bad.
I was gonna say, I guess the one thing about dying on the battlefield that would be like objectively better is that it would be fast. You know, in theory, like as long as you're not like wounded and slowly dying of a putrefying wound, because that would be equally terrible. But I mean, if you just like got like like your neck hacked off and you're just like pretty much dead, like that would be way faster than slowly falling apart.
Right. And it's like the narratives we tell about that death too, of it like preserving some sense of like freedom or defeating the enemy, and like West doesn't get any of that. It's like this mysterious illness that we know where it's coming from, but like nobody else really does. And
well, also it parallels Glocta in terms of like he was basically a war hero, like he is, and if he had just died in that blaze of glory, you know, he would have been remembered as this amazing. And even Ladislaw, before he gets killed by West, he's like, talking about this great epic hero, Sandan Glocta, shame he's dead. And West is like, he's not dead. He joined the Inquisition. Yeah. He's like, oh, what? And then like 5 minutes later, he's like, shame he's dead. Because he's like still on the, like, he can't accept the idea that he's alive and that he's crippled.
Right. Oh, man. Stylistically, I really liked the chapter where he has like echoing lines leading to the different perspectives. Like that was really cool.
Yes.
So I talked about this in my like year of Abercrombie video, where I just like talked about reading all the books in 1 year and how they compare and like re-ranked them, whatever. I bring it up because that specific thing, without spoilers and vaguely in that video, is like the way that like he takes what works and what doesn't work and learns his lessons from like the original trilogy and still experiments with now new and different narrative structures, and then like perfects the ones that did work. So like just because people found this meandering doesn't mean he was like, okay, so I have to tell very traditional stories now. He absolutely not. And that specific thing where I was like, the way that he weaves together perspectives, I was like, okay, that could describe any fantasy book with multiple perspectives, but the way he weaves together perspectives, and if you've read it, you know what I mean, that the way he does that, he like hones that until the Age of Madness trilogy. He does it in like, it's like Olympic level that, where like,
wow,
this is like the early version of that. So like reading it now, I'm like, oh, this is like Little League version of Abercrombie doing that.
I'm really excited to keep going.
Me too.
He's so good.
Yeah.
Like stylistically, I think it's just, it's like funny. It's great. I think so like well written. It's like all the things.
Yeah.
All the emotions. There are moments that were like super like emotionally real too. Like when some of the Northmen would die, I would be like sobbing.
I mean, even West dying, I think, is quite sad.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
And also the very first, well, now this was your first time, but like the very first time that Glocta goes to see Artie and you don't know what for.
Oh, yeah.
And it turns into a proposal. Now, every time I read it, I'm just like, oh yeah, this is I
love that scene. That's great.
And it's great too, because like, unlike other books where like a fake out works the first time, but you go back to read it, you're like, that doesn't actually make sense though, if that's actually what's happening. Whereas this, like, it completely still makes sense.
Yeah. Well, because of who he is. And that like he kind of had two options, right?
Yeah, but also the fact that like the way that he's thinking about what he's gonna do, he is at no point lying to the reader. Like that doesn't, he's very honest. It's just intentionally saying it just slightly vague enough to where like you're obviously gonna jump to the worst conclusion because it's Glocta.
Right.
And I think too, when it's already been like established as his character that he likes to save women too. Like it's not like so out of character because he saves that one woman.
But also that's why going into the Artie thing, because he's made a big point of to himself thinking, oh, I should not have been merciful to Ida. And like, I need to never, ever do that again. So now he's presented with the opportunity to correct that mistake with Artie. And you're like, well, I mean, he learned his like, lesson. Yeah. He's definitely not going to be merciful this time. And then you're like, bam, proposal.
Right. Well, I think, but also it's like, it makes me think that West trying to reach out after he came back, even if his mom turned him away, like I think that meant a lot to him, you know? And it seems like he really values that kind of loyalty because he doesn't really get it much. And so
he often thinks to himself about West being like, he had no friends, and then he realized that actually he still had one friend that he's rekindled that friendship with, and now he's already gone. So he's like, my one friend.
Right. It's like the least I can do is try to protect his sister, and
but they also like genuinely developed a good rapport while he was looking after her as a favor to West. But then actually, like all the times he talks to her, it's not this like romance novel thing of like, and she's actually so beautiful. Too bad she will never love me. He's more just like, well, she doesn't look at me in utter disgust. That's refreshing.
He's also really trying hard to convince her though, and she's just like, yeah, okay.
Sure, why not?
She literally takes the ring from him and is like, yep. Couldn't you find a bigger one? Courtesy of Valentin Balk.
Oh man.
It would have been interesting too to have like her perspective, because like it wasn't this like sad thing of I mean, her story like had its tragic moments, but like sometimes when that happens, it's like too much of like the Les Miserables tragedy. It's like when like you see that in some things. So I like the way that like her character plays out and how strong she is too. And
I like her too. I do wish we had her perspective because I just think it would be so interesting to be inside her head.
Yeah. Do we get it because she's in the next, didn't you say she's in Best Served Cold or just their
No,
kid?
she isn't. But in the later trilogy, Age of Madness, their daughter, Savine Dan Glocta, is one of the main characters. So like Artie, she's not a perspective, but she's mom to Savine, so she's around.
I like that.
Papa Glocta and Mommy Artie.
I like it too. I love them so much.
That's why the majority of the fan fiction is Glocta and Artie.
Yeah, look, I'm here for it. I also think that's part of why I love this book so much. Is like I want like a happy ending for Glocta.
Well, and because Giselle is like willfully deluded, he can be happy with Therese because Glocta had his chat with her, and she's like, "Oh, she was a virgin. She loved me all along." And you're like, "I'm glad you're happy. Giselle. I'm glad one of you is happy."
That was painful to read.
Well, because like you also, I mean, you do feel bad for like the way she's treating Giselle is like it's a bit much.
Yeah,
because he's like, I didn't pick this either. Like, stop hitting me. Like, why are you being so mean?
I mean, she's pretty awful.
And he doesn't at all consider like having his way with her. He's just like, I guess I'll sleep on the couch even though I'm the king. Like, oh no.
waiting for Logan and Pharaoh to get together at the end, like for them to like find each other.
No.
And I was like, I knew that it wasn't going to happen, but I was like waiting for something in that, and it never happened.
But like this isn't my friend. He desires fan fiction about Giselle and Logan because like, and he invented the hashtag #BroKingsForever because they're both kings by the end. And like, there's that moment when Logan is like having his like a little existential crisis, and he asks Giselle, "Do you think I'm a good man?" And he's like, "You're the best man that I know." Yeah, so cute.
It's so funny. Yeah, that's cute.
I love that the last scene of Logan, like coming, like he's jumping out a window.
Yeah, of course he is. Oh my gosh.
Over a cliff, right where we started.
Off a cliff, and like, so again, like he had these micro changes, and he made realizations. Like he's more self-aware in the last book, but the thing is he's realized that too much has happened, that it doesn't really change like how he exists in the world. So even though he's self-aware and understands himself and understands like the things that he wants and needs and all that, it doesn't matter because too much has happened in his life.
Which I mean, honestly, like it's not really more self-aware than he was in the first book, because in the first book he's already thinking to himself about how like he's a violent man and like he doesn't really have anything anymore, and he's getting what he deserves. Like he's already thinks that in book one. It's not like he came to that realization. What's more interesting, I think, to me is that he thinks to himself how nice it was to be on a quest with people who didn't know the Bloody Nine, and how like he could be not himself, but like he could be not burdened by that past. And then he goes home to the north to be with his people, and he cannot be anything but the Bloody Nine.
Right.
And it's interesting too, because I was expecting like a different reunion with the Northmen, like with his like group, because I think in the first one, because he thinks they're dead, you kind of get this idealized version of who they were together. And I think Logan still carries a little bit of that into his perspective, even as we get to know the Northmen. And then when he gets together with them again, it's like, oh, it wasn't all like brotherhood that you think it is, that he actually just was the leader because he was fucking scary. Like that's really it.
I mean, we do learn from him and from them early on that like they came to be part of his like crew because they failed to defeat him in the circle. Right. So like he had like not killed them, and that's why they are now together.
But for some reason, like even though we know that, I thought that there was like this brotherhood because he thinks of them so fondly, like still. And then like you get back and you're like, oh, they don't all love him. Like I don't know, but to me, like reading this the first time,
which is kind of like Giselle and Artie, you know, it's kind of the same thing.
Yeah, but I mean, they are pretty excited to see him though, because they thought he was dead. So I do love that moment when he pulls him. He's like, "Guess who I have here?" And he's like, "Dogman's like, can this wait?" He's like, "I don't think it can."
That is fun, and again, that feels like such like a real moment of what you would do if like your buddy came back. like who's here? I don't know.
Yeah. I just love guess who isn't dead. And I mean, I love all of the moments just in general throughout the books when somebody either talks about the Bloody Nine and Logan doesn't tell him that that's who he is and they don't realize it, and he just like lets them not realize it, or alternatively when they're talking about the Bloody Nine and they do realize that that's who he is, because he's like, you know, here's my hand with the missing finger, and they're like, oh.
And I love that we don't know that for most of the first book. Like I love that it would be fun to do a reread again, like knowing that, because it's like we don't.
It really is fun to do a reread.
Because that whole first book, like Logan was so different to me, because like you don't know that about him. Like you know that he has like a dark past, and like you know, but you don't know what the Bloody Nine is. Like you don't know what that means until the end.
And so it's like it's like a trick, but it's not one that I'm pissed about, because it allows the reader to fall in love with the character of Logan before you see it, and then by the time you see it, that's bad. But like I already like him, so it's fine.
It's like bad guys.
The first book is really fun to reread, like because there are so many clues and like little things that you're like, oh, like there's so much there. It's fun.
Because I mean, for a book that seems meandering and plotless, it's just like bursting with references and foreshadowing and like clues and
yeah.
I bumped up my rating on book one when I reread it.
It's all 5 stars to me.
Yes, that's the answer we want.
I just from the very beginning, like I would get so excited every time I would finish a scene. Like I just really love that he, like, as a storytelling wise, like, he just rewards his readers, not in like the usual way, like not in like the usual payoffs,
not in a Marvel way.
Not in a Marvel way, yeah, like not in the Captain Marvel way where she like stands up at the end and, like, you know. But
it's
like,
also, it's not even like the gimmicky kind of Marvel where you're like, oh, like it all came together and everything is like connected, and you're like, that's fun, but like that's not what he's doing.
No, it's like just like this like you have to be a little bit patient in that first book to like see what's going on. And then when I got to like the end, like again, it's like the end of every book, like the end of the first one where he like gathers all these people for this quest and none of them want to go on it. And in the end of the second one where they're going on a journey and then like the thing that they're looking for, that whole book isn't there. Like, I just like, who is that? Abercrombie.
Which also, like, I love the fact that the thing was actually where they started.
Yes.
Like, it's not just characters. It's not just characters that end up where they started.
Yeah, but like the thing, like, so Farah finds it and it's in the house of the maker.
And it's interesting also because like what they say about at the end of the world is, you know, if you want to hide a rock, hide it among a pile of rocks.
Yeah.
And they're like, okay, I mean, that's still true. Like that's what they did. And Farrell remembers that. And she's like, well, it was just a different pile of rocks. It was the pile of rocks in the house of the maker.
Yeah.
But also, speaking of not being able to find it, like that comes back when they're interrogating Longfoot. And he's like, we went there and there was nothing. So he's like, you went there and there was nothing? Like, we are going to believe that. And he's like, it's true.
Yeah. And then like, if you think about like the third being this, like, again, like you think, like if you think about the third book in the Lord of the Rings, like, you know, the rightful king is in place, like all of the lovers are together, and like Frodo's a little sad with the, like just a little messed up from it, but like everyone else. And like here at the end of this, like you think Giselle is like the long lost king, but he's not. Like he's just like this random guy. And at the end, he's not like even really put into power. And so it is this, again, this kind of interesting commentary on like where you think you're going to end up.
Well, also you like finally get a bunch of truth about all the stories that Baez has been telling about all of the different monarchs and how Giselle should try to be like them. And then he's like, they were nincompoops. Like they were all idiots. I just told you what people thought about them because that's what you should aspire to have people think about you. But like, don't risk yourself in battle. Don't ever do that.
Yeah, I wrote down like the quote of what he said, which I thought was interesting at that point, where he was like, it's easy to find someone to lead a charge, not to lead a kingdom. Like, like I can find anybody to like lead guys in a battle, but like I groomed you to lead the kingdoms. That's what you're gonna do.
It's like I had options and you did have a certain charisma. So I was like, I can work with that because that you can't teach.
Yeah. Yep. Well, and I had totally forgotten that the maker's daughter comes back.
Oh yes. Yeah.
Well, this is why, like, when we were talking spoilers at the end of the episode on the blade itself, I was like, I had never picked up on the fact that when Glokta goes to the university and he goes and pulls that old book, that the one page that's missing is the one on Ptolemy. That page is gone.
Yeah. Well, and like I had noticed that, but like I completely forgot that she actually shows up again at all. And I was like, oh right. Like I had remembered that Baez killed her.
And that like, Malleus Quai is not Quai for the majority of the trilogy.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
Which is why, again, on a reread, it's fun to notice when Quai starts to be a lot smarter. And then I mean, like, if you know you're looking for it, you'll notice it faster than Baez does. But Baez also notices it eventually. He's like, you are doing a lot better in answering questions today than usual. And then like other people notice it as well, where they're like, he looks different. He looks a little sinister.
Well, he starts like asking like leading questions. Like, Baez, tell us what really happened. Like at the end of book 2, he starts to get more aggressive about like wanting to know. And I wondered, I was like, is this like, at first I thought like, because he had gotten sick, I was like, did the sickness change him? Like because you notice that change, he's so much more aggressive. And then obviously that was not it. He's literally a different person.
Yeah.
Which like when Logan thinks to himself like, man, I should be sad Quai is dead, but I carried him all that way to save his life, but I just can't care about anything anymore. He also doesn't even know that he's been dead this whole time. He just knows that he's dead, and he kind of assumes that he has died recently, and isn't that sad? Because no one clues Logan in on the fact that actually he died 2 books ago. It's not been him for a long time.
Yeah.
But I do like Logan and Giselle's like bromance like through the second book.
Yeah.
Or I guess it's
definitely a hate to love.
Yeah.
It's like a dad-son kind of thing.
It kind of is. Yeah.
Or again, like it's something that isn't sustained in reality because they both have to go their separate ways. And like, again, you know, it's like all of these things that I was like,
but Giselle still thinks well of Logan, even though he's like royalty now. He doesn't revert to thinking of him as like a dumb barbarian. He's like, you're the best man that I like. If he could appoint him Lord Marshal, he would have.
Yeah.
We haven't even talked about Pharaoh at all. Everyone always forgets about Pharaoh.
Yeah, I guess I just like don't find her that interesting. We did talk about her like finding the seed.
Yeah, and I mean her tenacity and like wanting revenge, and she's the only one that questions Baez and follows him and is like, I don't care.
Yeah,
you owe me. And the way that like it's through her for the most part that we get glimpses into anything that is like supernatural about this world. She's like the only POV character that gives us that.
Yeah.
I will say one of my favorite scenes in the third book is when they announce that Giselle is the king, and you can hear a voice laughing, and it's Pharaoh.
Yeah.
And even Giselle, when he hears it, is like, that's kind of my reaction. You shouldn't be laughing, but also like I kind of want to laugh too. Because
I was laughing as well. Like I was like, because that whole scene is sort of ridiculous. I love it. I love that scene and that she's laughing, and that
also
she just makes
Pharaoh kidnapping. Yeah. Pharaoh kidnapping and questioning Glokta.
Oh yeah, that
was
was
scenes. Yeah.
Well, and I think it's especially interesting because it's like right after these other people, like other people are like totally incompetent. Yeah, like go Pharaoh. That's hard to like. It's hard to outsmart Glokta.
We haven't really talked about Baez finally telling Glokta how it is. The way of the world.
Right.
And that he would like him to be in charge. And though he's like, you know, you fumbled so close to the truth this whole time. You almost got it. I'm like, everyone else is a complete idiot.
It's like, and it's that mundane answer. Like, I've just, you know, it's money. It's been me the whole time. I'm in charge.
Yep.
And when he's like, I love when Baez is like, you know, for such a miserable life, you certainly fight hard to keep it. And Glokta's like, I don't want to live. I just don't want to lose.
Yes.
Yep.
The fact that I was like, oh, I identify with that. And I was like, wait a minute, that's not a healthy.
I feel like that's a lot of like, I said this before, that like the books, like the grimdark of these books is the truths you learn about yourself along the way.
You're like, oh, I really love that torture. There was a point though when I was reading book 3 where I told Leanna, I was like, I'm getting a little bit tired of the torture. Like, just
a smidge.
A little too much. A little bit. There was like parts of it that I was like,
but also like, speaking of like heartbreaking moments, it genuinely broke my heart that both Severard and Frost betrayed Glokta.
Yeah.
I was like, both?
Both. But I mean, I
love that Brother Longfoot got to go free because like he's ridiculous and annoying, but I was like, he's so funny.
When he does the like, do you understand? And he's like, yes. And he starts giving like a 10-word answer. He's like, no. Do you see what you did wrong there? I was looking for a yes or a no. Yes.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of it that's just really funny. No, it was fun. I think on a reread, it was interesting because I could see all of the moments where Baez is like putting pieces together and preparing to make Giselle king. Because like I didn't know that was where it was going.
How could
the first time I read it. Did you? And Heather, I'm curious, like if you picked up on that or not.
Yeah, I mean, in the second book, I was like, he's clearly preparing him for something, and so I figured he would become some kind of king. I didn't realize it, but again, it like happened in a lot more mundane way than I thought it would. Like I thought it was going to be like a Return of the King kind of here's the king moment. And the fact that he was like actually just like this pawn was like what was the surprising part. But I could tell in book 2 that like he was preparing him for something. So, but again, just like how it happened and how.
Well, and also, I mean, even in like book 3, when he's like Giselle, you know, stops to help some peasant, And he's like, I guess I've committed to helping now because I said something. Okay, I'm helping. And then Bias is like, this is Giselle Dan Luther, and he's blah, blah, blah. And he's like, you can find him at this address and follow him on the social medias. And he's like, why are you telling everybody my name?
I was like, that's a little on the nose, Bias. That's a little.
Yeah. But also, I think it's hard to realize that that's what's happened, even though it does tell you, like, it's clear, like, if you're paying attention, that the entire peasant uprising is invented by Bias.
Yeah.
Which, like, I think, like, when it kind of flies by, and it's only really, like, when Giselle's like, what? Wait, why are you immediately giving into negotiations? And then, like, as I pointed out before, like, anytime someone has two different color eyes, it's Yoru Sulfur. And the fact that Giselle notices that the leader of the peasant uprising has two different color eyes, and you've heard Bias talk to Yoru Sulfur and be like, are you taking care of, like, the thing? And he's like, yep, I'm on it.
Yeah.
So,
and that's
like,
why he just immediately is like, okay.
I didn't even know that. See, this is why I need to read them again.
Yeah, well, like, and I didn't notice that the first time, but this time I did. I was like, oh, Bias, like, did that whole, like, just made that happen for, like, PR reasons.
Well, also later, so Glocta sees, what's his name, Morovia, in pieces all over his office. Meanwhile, Morovia is with Giselle defending the city because it's Yoru Sulfur. Because Giselle notices that Morovia, now that he's up close to him, has two different color eyes.
Wow, I like didn't even know that. I'll notice that. So reread it.
Yep.
Because he's an eater, a shape changer, and he works for Bias because Bias doesn't care. He has this like holy war between him and the guy who's in charge of eaters.
Like little details that if you reread them, I feel like you just pick up on more stuff. Yeah, it's so interesting.
So it's almost as if then, like, the idea of the First Law trilogy, it's like ironic because he doesn't even listen. No one listens to the first, like, to all of those anyway.
Right.
Well, I mean, Bias, like, I had forgotten that he actually says this because I asked Joe Abercrombie, like, why it was called the First Law trilogy, because the first law is that, all magic comes from the other side, but you can't touch the other side or whatever. But I had forgotten that there's literally, like, at the end of Last Argument of Kings, Bias outright says the first law is my law. Whatever I say is what is correct. It doesn't matter about anything else.
Yeah.
And that is what the whole trilogy is about.
Yeah. So that he told us in the first book.
He did.
By the very title of the trilogy. Genius, Abercrombie.
Yep. Well, and it's like little things. I know I mentioned this, but on an earlier episode, but Heather, like the fact that, like, in the Blade itself, when you first see Bias, he's dressed as a butcher. Like the first scene.
Yeah, when Logan goes into the little, like, the little home area behind the gate, and he sees this old wise man with a long beard, and he's like, well, now you look like the first of the Magi. He's like, what? No, I'm not the first of the Magi. It's that guy over there. And he's like wearing a leather apron covered in blood because he's a butcher.
See, I need to like go back and notice all these things.
Yeah. There's so much foreshadowing, like, everywhere.
Yeah.
Well, and the fact that, I mean, when Logan gets pissed because he's learned that Bethod gave him up for Bias because Bias was like, my payment is going to be that you spare the life of Logan Ninefingers. And he's like, you never told me. And he's like, you, my boy, literally didn't want to know. Yeah. You were happy in your ignorance. Like, you had your chance and you didn't want to know.
Yep.
Yeah.
Trilogy. It is. I mean, I think that's the thing is, for me, the, like, individually, I don't know that these books are like 5 stars for me, but as a trilogy, it 100% is.
And it's definitely like, I mean, in theory, any trilogy is 3 parts of a whole, but some feel more so than others. Like some feel like they stand on their own a little bit more, whereas this trilogy really does feel like one story that's split into parts.
Yeah.
Like, I often have difficulty because I reread them so much, and I usually read them pretty back to back. I to this day have trouble remembering exactly, like, the events that are, like, nearer the ends and beginnings of books, like, exactly which one it's in.
Yeah.
Like Giselle helping the peasant girl when they get back. I'm like, is that the end of Before They Were Hanged or the beginning of Last Argument of Kings?
I don't even know.
I'd just be curious. I can't, unless you want me to confirm or deny, but I'd be curious to know who among these characters you either expect to see or most want to see in the later books.
Glocta and Artie.
Well, you know they're going to be in it, so
I know, which I'm very happy about because I love them. They're great. They're my favorite.
I love.
Logan, I will say, reading because he does like drawing from existing stuff all the time, just because it always makes a scene more interesting if there's somebody that you know. It's like, why not draw from that well when you have it? But there are definitely characters that, like, rereading the trilogy, there's just literally no reason you'd have paid that much attention to them if you're only reading the trilogy. But because, like, they or their descendants become very, very relevant in later books, that, like, now the name is a name that you know, so that when it pops up, you're like, oh, that's his dad. Like, that's, So it's fun to go back and reread once you've read everything, because you're like, all these, like, little characters that you're like, oh, and he's going to use you later for the thing. Yeah.
That's cool. Well, I think we're, like, running out of time on this. So
I can go for like 10 more hours.
I know. I know. But it's been fun rereading it, and, like, I'm excited to get to new material and finally read stuff I haven't read yet. I think it'll be good.
Shivers.
Yeah. So for anybody following along with us, we are taking a month off of the read along, and then we will be back in May with Best Served Cold, correct? That's the next one? Yeah. So we'll be reading Best Served Cold in May if you're following along with us, and then we'll do the standalones, take a month off, and then do the final trilogy. So it should be fun. So it is time for On My Radar, where we're going to share recent and upcoming book releases in science fiction, fantasy, and romance we're excited about. Books for today's episode will be released between March 22nd and April 4th, 2022, with the exception of any guest recommendations. Anything recent or upcoming is fine. But first, if you enjoy the podcast, we'd appreciate if you take a moment to rate and review us so we can continue to reach more listeners. And if you're interested in getting early access to episodes and exclusive bonus content with every episode, consider supporting us on Patreon. Huge thanks to all of our supporting patrons, including our world-expanding patrons, Trina and Sarah. You all make what we do possible, and we appreciate all of your support. I've got 3 books this week I want to talk about, and I think everybody's got some things. Lena's got one, Heather's I think got some, but all 3 of the ones I want to mention are coming out March 22nd. The first one is The Bone Orchard by Sarah A. Mueller. I read this one and it is very interesting. It is this debut novel that is such a genre mashup. It's like a sci-fantasy horror murder mystery sort of thing that is really interesting, a bit dark, but is tackling some big issues like the treatment of sex workers, among other things. So it's a really interesting book, and I feel like, I don't know, I'm curious to see like what people think of it. So it's coming out March 22nd. I really liked it. It like totally sucked me in by the end. There's a lot of like political machinations and stuff, so it's interesting. Also coming out on the 22nd is The City of Dusk by Tara Sim. This one I'm curious about. She's written YA fantasy before, and this is her adult fantasy debut. It says it's set in a gorgeous world of bone and shadow magic, vengeful gods, and defiant chosen ones. The first in a dark epic fantasy trilogy following 4 heirs of 4 noble houses, each gifted with a divine power as they form a tenuous alliance to keep their kingdom from descending into a realm-shattering war. So it sounds promising. I'm curious to see how that one is. And then lastly, I've got a romance coming out that day. Savvy Sheldon Feels Good as Hell by Taj McCoy. This one looks really fun. It's a delicious debut rom-com about a plus-size sweetheart who gets a full life makeover after a brutal breakup. And it looks adorable. So those are the 3 I'm excited about. Anybody else?
Yeah. It was actually like last week, there were 2 books that came out. One was Saba Tahir's new book, All My Rage. And it's about, like, I think it's a young teen romance, but it's also about what it's like being a Pakistani immigrant. And I think that part of it takes place back in Pakistan too. And it sounds really interesting. And then Tessa Bailey has a new one called Hook, Line, and Sinker. And it's supposed to be like a romance / mystery. When that one sounds really fun. And then the 3rd one comes out this Tuesday. It's called Blood Scion, and it's like a new YA fantasy by a Black author, Deborah. But that one looks really fun. It's like a fun YA fantasy with magic and stuff. So I'm excited about that one.
Awesome.
Mine comes out April 5th, and that is Sense and Second Degree Murder by Tirzah Price, which is the second in a series of like Jane Austen murder mysteries, where retelling. I read Pride and Premeditation, and it does like sort of what if Pride and Prejudice was instead about like Lizzie wanting to be a barrister and solving a murder. and Darcy is from a competing firm. But in like the Regency.
Yeah.
So Sense and Second Degree Murder will, I guess, follow in those footsteps, but be Sense and Sensibility.
Oh, that's fun.
So
nice.
That sounds fun.
So as always, all of those books, if you're looking for them, will be linked in the show notes or in the video description if you are watching us on YouTube. Thanks, Heather, for joining us. It was fun having you for our chat.
This was fun.
Yeah, this was great. And if you want to check out Heather's Instagram, it'll be linked again in the video description or the show notes. This has been Chapter 3 Podcast, and Leanna and I are your hosts. You can follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok at Chapter 3 Podcast. And you can also find us on our individual YouTube channels, which are always linked below. The next episode will be available in 2 weeks, and this episode's bonus content will be available to patrons in the next few days. Thanks for listening.